Standing outside the dealership in my cap and gown, watching my father hand Mercedes keys to my younger sister who dropped out junior year, I realized 22 years of being the responsible daughter meant absolutely nothing. While I graduated summa cum laude with a finance degree, taking 3 buses to get here because public transport builds character, Melody got a $60,000 car for finally getting her GED. The same father who made me work 2 jobs through college was now celebrating her bare minimum achievement like she had cured cancer. But what I discovered in his office that night would make this Mercedes look like pocket change compared to what he had really stolen from me. Hey everyone! Before we dive into this absolutely wild family drama that had me questioning everything I thought I knew about loyalty and fairness, I want to know where you are watching from. Drop your city in the comments below. And if this story hits close to home, smash that like button and subscribe because trust me, the revenge I served was colder than my father's heart. You will not believe how this family betrayal unraveled and the sweet justice that followed. My name is Scarlett, and for 22 years I believed I was the problem child in our family. Not because I was rebellious or reckless, but because I apparently never did enough to earn my father Richard's approval. While my sister Melody partied through high school and dropped out to find herself through various failed ventures, I maintained a 4.0 GP. Worked at a local accounting firm and paid for my own college education through scholarships and sleepless nights. The Mercedes incident was not the first time I had witnessed this blatant favoritism, but it was the moment that broke something fundamental inside me. Watching Melody squeal with delight while our father beamed with pride, I felt like I was watching strangers celebrate in a language I would never understand. When I approached them in the parking lot, still wearing my graduation gown, my father barely glanced my way. "Congratulations on finally getting your degree, Scarlett," he said dismissively, already turning back to explain the car's features to Melody. "I trust you can find your way home. Your sister needs help moving her things into her new apartment." The new apartment. Another gift I had never received despite maintaining perfect grades and working myself to exhaustion. When I asked about it later, my father explained that Melody needed more support because she was still figuring things out while I was naturally independent and capable. That night, something inside me snapped. I had spent years accepting these explanations, convincing myself that love looked different for different children. But as I sat in my tiny studio apartment eating ramen noodles while knowing my sister was probably picking out furniture for her luxury space, I realized I had been gaslit into believing that receiving less meant I needed less. The next morning, I made a decision that would change everything. I called my father's office and told his secretary I needed to discuss some financial documents for a project at work. She knew me as the responsible daughter who occasionally helped with family business matters, so she granted me access to his office during his lunch meeting. What I found in his filing cabinets made my blood run cold. Hidden behind tax documents and business contracts were detailed financial records showing systematic embezzlement from my grandmother's trust fund. The same grandmother who had always promised that her savings would help secure my future, who had worked 2 jobs her entire life to build something for her granddaughters. The trust fund that I was told had been depleted by medical expenses when she passed away 3 years ago. But these documents told a different story. My father had been the trustee, and he had systematically drained over $400,000 to fund Melody's lifestyle. Private school tuition, luxury vacations, shopping sprees, the apartment down payment, and now this Mercedes. All of it paid for with money that was supposed to be split equally between Melody and me. The most devastating part was discovering a handwritten note from my grandmother attached to the original trust documents. In her shaky handwriting, she had specified that the money was intended to reward hard work and dedication, and that I should receive the larger portion because of my commitment to education and responsibility. My father had not only stolen from both of us, but he had deliberately given my inheritance to my sister while making me believe I was not worthy of financial support. Every time I had struggled to pay tuition every night, I had worked double shifts every moment. I had felt like I was not enough in his eyes. He had been funding my sister's carefree lifestyle with money that was rightfully mine. But the documents revealed something even more sinister. My father had forged my grandmother's signature on several amendments to the trust, changing the distribution and adding himself as a beneficiary. He had used my grandmother's money not just to spoil Melody, but to fund his own business ventures, including the expansion of his consulting firm and a vacation home in Colorado that I had never even known existed. As I photographed every document with trembling hands, I realized this was not just about favoritism or unfair treatment. This was fraud, embezzlement, and a betrayal that went far deeper than anything I had imagined. My father had not just failed to love me equally, he had actively stolen from me while making me feel grateful for scraps. The weight of this discovery was crushing, but underneath the devastation, something else was growing. A cold, calculating anger that would fuel everything that came next. My father had taught me to be thorough, analytical, and strategic through years of demanding perfection from me. He had no idea that he had been training me to be his downfall. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by copies of evidence planning my next move. This was not going to be about emotional confrontations or family meetings. This was going to be about justice, legal consequences, and ensuring that everyone who had enabled this betrayal would face exactly what they deserved. My father had always told me that actions have consequences. It was time for him to learn just how right he was. The first person I contacted was not a lawyer or law enforcement, but my grandmother's former attorney, Margaret Wells. I had found her contact information in the trust documents, and something told me she might have suspected irregularities even before my discovery. When I called her office and explained who I was, there was a long pause that spoke volumes. "Scarlett," she said carefully, "I have been hoping someone would call me about that trust. Can you come in tomorrow?" Margaret's office was filled with family photos and legal awards, but her expression was grim as I spread the evidence across her conference table. As she examined each document, her face grew increasingly dark with anger. "Your grandmother was one of my dearest friends," she began, "and she was very specific about her intentions for this trust. She came to me multiple times expressing concerns about your father's financial decisions and his obvious favoritism toward Melody. That is why she structured the trust the way she did, with specific provisions to ensure you received support for your education and future." What Margaret told me next changed everything. My grandmother had not died peacefully in her sleep as I had been told. She had spent her final weeks trying to get in touch with me directly, asking Margaret to help her contact me because she suspected my father was intercepting her calls and letters. She had discovered some irregularities in her bank statements and wanted to warn me, but she passed away before she could reach me. "Your father told me you were too busy with school to visit her in the hospital," Margaret continued, "but she kept asking for you right until the end. She made me promise to watch over this trust and ensure her wishes were honored." The betrayal cut even deeper now. Not only had my father stolen my inheritance, but he had prevented me from saying goodbye to the one person in our family who had truly understood and supported me. He had robbed me of those final moments while using her money to reward the daughter who could not even be bothered to visit. Margaret immediately began legal proceedings to freeze all remaining trust assets and initiated a formal investigation into the embezzlement. But she also gave me advice that would prove crucial: document everything, involve law enforcement from the beginning, and be prepared for your family to turn against you completely. "Your father is not going to accept responsibility quietly," she warned. "Men like him will blame everyone except themselves. He will try to paint you as vindictive, greedy, or mentally unstable. Make sure you have allies and evidence for everything." Armed with Margaret's guidance, I spent the next week building an ironclad case. I obtained official bank records, documented every forged signature with handwriting experts, and created a detailed timeline of the embezzlement. Margaret connected me with a financial crimes detective who specializes in family trust fraud. Detective Lisa Morrison was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who had seen every variation of family financial betrayal imaginable. When she reviewed my evidence, she immediately recognized the sophistication of my father's scheme. "This is not impulsive theft," she explained. "This is systematic planned embezzlement with intent to permanently deprive the beneficiaries of their inheritance. The forged signatures alone constitute multiple felony counts, and the amount involved makes this a serious white-collar crime." But Detective Morrison also warned me about the emotional toll of prosecuting family members. "Once you file these charges, there is no going back. Your relationship with your father and sister will be permanently destroyed. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about my graduation day, about years of working multiple jobs while my sister lived in luxury, about my grandmother dying alone while asking for me. "Detective Morrison," I said firmly, "that relationship was destroyed long before I found these documents. I am just finally seeing it clearly." The moment of truth came on a Tuesday morning when Detective Morrison and 2 other officers arrived at my father's office with a warrant for his arrest. I was not there to witness it, but according to Margaret, who had coordinated with law enforcement, my father's reaction was exactly what she had predicted. He immediately called me, screaming about betrayal and family loyalty. "How could you do this to your own father?" he demanded. "After everything I have done for this family, you repay me by having me arrested like a common criminal." "Everything you have done for this family," I replied calmly. "You mean stealing Grandma's money while she was dying? Using my inheritance to buy Melody a car while I worked 3 jobs? Or maybe you mean preventing me from saying goodbye to the one person who actually loved me?" There was silence on the other end before he switched tactics. "You are making a terrible mistake, Scarlett. Families handle these matters privately. You are going to destroy this family over money. You destroyed this family when you decided I was worth less than Melody," I responded. "The money is just evidence of something that started long before Grandma died." Within hours, the story had spread through our extended family and my father's business community. The arrest had been reported in the local newspaper, complete with details about the embezzlement and forged documents. My phone was flooded with calls from relatives I had not heard from in years, some offering support, others demanding explanations. But the call that surprised me most came from my Aunt Patricia, my father's younger sister, who had always seemed to worship her successful older brother. "Scarlett," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something that I should have said years ago. Your father borrowed money from me 5 years ago to invest in Melody's future. He told me you did not need help because you were getting scholarships. I gave him $15,000 that he promised to repay, and I never saw a penny of it." Patricia's revelation opened floodgates. Over the next few days, I received calls from family friends, business associates, and even some of Melody's friends, all sharing stories of my father's financial manipulation and lies. The picture that emerged was of a man who had been systematically deceiving everyone in his life to maintain an image of success while funding his favorite daughter's lifestyle. The most shocking revelation came from my Uncle David, who told me that my grandmother had tried to contact him shortly before her death, expressing concerns about my father's control over her finances. She had asked David to help her change the trust arrangements, but she died before they could meet with Margaret together. As this network of deception unraveled, I realized that my father's favoritism toward Melody was not just about love or personality differences. It was about control and image. Melody represented the easy path, the child who would never question or challenge him. I represented accountability, the child who might one day discover his secrets and demand answers. But he had underestimated the very qualities that made him uncomfortable with me. My attention to detail, my persistence, and my refusal to accept unfair treatment were exactly what would bring his carefully constructed lies crashing down around him. The investigation was moving quickly, but I knew this was only the beginning. My father had spent years building alliances and cultivating an image as a successful family man. The real battle was about to begin, and I needed to be prepared for warfare. The news of my father's arrest spread through our community like wildfire, and the reactions fell into predictable patterns that revealed years of hidden dynamics I had never fully understood. What I discovered was that many people had suspected something was wrong with our family's financial situation, but no one had been willing to speak up until now. My first unexpected ally came from the most unlikely source, my former high school guidance counselor, Mrs. Rodriguez. She reached out to me through Facebook with a message that made me realize how many people had been quietly watching and documenting my father's behavior over the years. Scarlett. Her message read, "I have been following your story in the news, and I want you to know that several faculty members at the high school have been concerned about your family situation for years. Your father's behavior during parent conferences was often inappropriate, and we documented several incidents where he made disparaging comments about you while praising Melody excessively. If you need character witnesses or evidence of the long-term pattern of favoritism, we have records." This revelation led me to reach out to other people from my past who might have observed the family dynamics. What I found was a network of adults who had been quietly concerned about the treatment I received, but had felt powerless to intervene in a family situation. My former boss at the accounting firm, Thomas Mitchell, was particularly valuable as an ally. He had worked with my father on several business transactions and had always been impressed by my work ethic and professionalism. When I explained the situation, he immediately offered to provide testimony about both my character and some questionable financial advice my father had given to mutual clients. "Your father always spoke about Melody like she was his crowning achievement," Thomas told me during our meeting. "But he talked about you like you were an employee who needed constant supervision. It was uncomfortable to witness, especially knowing how capable and hardworking you are." But Thomas also provided information that added another layer to my father's crimes. He revealed that my father had been offering investment advice to several clients without proper licensing, using his role as trustee of my grandmother's estate to establish credibility. Several people had lost money following his recommendations, and Thomas had been documenting these incidents in case someone eventually filed complaints. This information led me to another crucial ally, Sarah Kim, a financial advisor who had been receiving complaints about my father's unlicensed activities for over a year. Sarah had been building her own case against him for securities violations, but had been waiting for someone with standing to come forward as a complainant. "Your father has been operating in a gray area for years," Sarah explained. "He uses his personal relationships and family connections to gain trust, then provides investment advice that benefits his own interests. The trust embezzlement gives us the credibility we need to investigate his broader financial misconduct." As my network of allies grew, I also began receiving support from unexpected family members who had been quietly disapproving of my father's treatment of me for years. My cousin Jennifer, who had always seemed neutral in family disputes, called to offer both emotional support and crucial information. "I need to tell you about last Christmas," Jennifer said during our conversation. "When Melody was showing off her new jewelry and talking about her European vacation, my mom asked your father how he could afford all these gifts for her while you were working so many hours to pay for school. He told her that you had specifically asked him not to help you financially because you wanted to build character through struggle. This lie was particularly cruel because it made my extended family believe that I had chosen to struggle financially while my sister lived in luxury." Jennifer's revelation helped explain why several relatives had seemed distant toward me in recent years. They thought I was pridefully refusing help that was being offered. But the most important ally I gained during this period was someone I never expected: Melody's former roommate, Amanda Torres. Amanda reached out to me after seeing the news coverage, and what she told me changed my understanding of Melody's role in this entire situation. "I lived with Melody for 2 years, Amanda explained, "and she used to brag constantly about how your father loved her more because she was smart enough to play the game. She knew exactly what she was doing, Scarlett. She would call your father crying about needing money, then laugh about it afterward, and say you were stupid for not manipulating him the same way." Amanda had recordings on her phone of Melody making these comments, including one particularly damaging conversation where Melody admitted she knew the money was coming from a trust fund that was supposed to be shared with me. In the recording, Melody laughed about how I was too ethical to realize what was happening and how she was going to milk this situation for as long as possible. This evidence destroyed any illusion I had maintained that Melody was simply a spoiled child who did not understand the situation. She was a willing participant in defrauding me, and she had been actively working to maintain the deception that kept me struggling while she prospered. Armed with Amanda's recordings and testimony, I met with Detective Morrison to update her on the expanding scope of the investigation. She was particularly interested in the securities violations and the pattern of financial manipulation that extended beyond the trust embezzlement. What you have uncovered suggests this is not just a case of family theft, Detective Morrison explained. Your father appears to be running what amounts to a small-scale financial fraud operation using family relationships and community trust to exploit multiple victims. Melody's knowing participation makes her an accomplice rather than just a beneficiary. The investigation expanded to include multiple charges: embezzlement, forgery, securities fraud, and conspiracy. Detective Morrison assembled a task force that included specialists in white-collar crime, family financial abuse, and elder fraud, since my grandmother's age and vulnerability at the time of her death added another dimension to the crimes. But even as my case grew stronger, I was also experiencing the emotional toll that Margaret had warned me about. Several family members were pressuring me to drop the charges and handle this privately. My father's business partners were spreading rumors that I was mentally unstable and motivated by greed rather than justice. The most painful pressure came from my Aunt Helen, my mother's sister, who had always been supportive of me in the past. She called me crying, begging me to consider the impact on the family's reputation and my father's ability to earn a living. Your father made mistakes, Helen pleaded, but destroying his career will not bring your grandmother back or undo the hurt you have experienced. Sometimes the mature thing to do is forgive and move forward. But I had moved far beyond the point where family pressure could deter me. Each new piece of evidence, each ally who came forward with their own story of being deceived or manipulated by my father, strengthened my resolve to see this through to the end. The turning point came when Margaret received a call from another attorney who had been following our case in the legal community. She represented an elderly client who suspected that my father had given him fraudulent investment advice that resulted in significant losses. This client was prepared to file his own lawsuit, and his attorney believed there might be other victims who would come forward once they saw that someone was successfully challenging my father's financial misconduct. As I sat in Margaret's office reviewing the latest evidence and planning our strategy for the upcoming court hearings, I realized that what had started as a personal quest for justice had become something much larger. My father's decades of financial manipulation were finally being exposed, and the network of allies I had built was strong enough to withstand whatever counterattacks he might launch. But I also knew that the most difficult part was still ahead. My father was not going to accept defeat quietly, and I was about to learn just how far he was willing to go to protect himself and discredit me in the process. The betrayal came from the person I least expected, and at the moment when I felt most confident about the strength of my case. 3 weeks before the preliminary hearing, I received a panicked call from Amanda Torres, whose recordings of Melody had become crucial evidence in proving my sister's knowing participation in the fraud. "Scarlett, I need to see you immediately." Amanda's voice was shaking. "Something terrible has happened, and I do not know what to do." We met at a coffee shop near her apartment, and Amanda looked like she had not slept in days. Her hands were trembling as she pulled out her phone and showed me a series of text messages that made my blood run cold. The messages were from my father, but they were not threatening or angry as I would have expected. Instead, they were manipulative and calculating, offering Amanda a substantial sum of money to recant her testimony and claim that the recordings had been taken out of context or edited to sound more damaging than they actually were. "He contacted me through my cousin Marcus," Amanda explained, "who works at your father's consulting firm. At first, I ignored the messages, but then he started offering more and more money. $50,000, Scarlett. He is offering me $50,000 to say that I misunderstood what Melody was saying in those recordings." What made this betrayal even more devastating was Amanda's next revelation. She had not called me to warn me about my father's bribery attempts. She had called me to ask if I thought she should take the money. "My student loans are crushing me," she continued, "and my mom needs surgery that insurance will not cover. Your father says this whole case is just about sibling rivalry, and that sending him to prison will not actually help anyone. He says you are wealthy enough from your job to support yourself, and that this money could change my family's life." I stared at Amanda in disbelief, realizing that my father had perfectly identified her financial vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. But what hurt most was seeing someone I had trusted wrestle with the decision to sell out my grandmother's memory and my quest for justice for money. "Amanda," I said carefully, "that $50,000 is probably stolen from someone else just like he stole from my grandmother. If you take it, you become part of his pattern of using money to manipulate people and cover up his crimes." But I could see in her eyes that she had already made her decision. The combination of financial desperation and my father's manipulation had been too powerful. Amanda took the money and formally recanted her testimony, claiming that she had misinterpreted Melody's comments and that the recordings did not prove intentional fraud. This betrayal sent shockwaves through my legal team. Amanda's recordings had been some of our strongest evidence that Melody was a knowing participant rather than an innocent beneficiary. Without her testimony, it would be much harder to prove conspiracy charges against my sister. But the damage went deeper than just losing evidence. Amanda's defection gave my father's defense team a narrative they could use against me. They began arguing that I was so desperate to prove my case that I was pressuring people to provide false testimony against my family. Amanda's willingness to recant, they claimed, proved that my evidence was built on misunderstandings and manipulation rather than actual crimes. Detective Morrison was furious when I told her what had happened. "Your father is now actively obstructing justice by bribing witnesses," she said. "This actually gives us more charges we can file against him, but it also shows how desperate he is becoming. Desperate people do dangerous things." Her warning proved prophetic. Within days of Amanda's betrayal, I began experiencing a campaign of harassment and intimidation that was clearly orchestrated by my father and his allies. My tires were slashed twice in 1 week. Someone broke into my apartment while I was at work, though nothing was stolen, making it clear that the break-in was meant to frighten me rather than rob me. Most disturbing were the rumors that began circulating in my professional and personal circles. Colleagues at my accounting firm started avoiding me after hearing whispers that I was unstable and pursuing a vendetta against my family. Several clients specifically requested that I not work on their accounts, citing concerns about my emotional state and family drama. The psychological pressure was intense, but the financial pressure was worse. My father's legal team filed a counter lawsuit against me, claiming defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. They argued that my false accusations had damaged his reputation and business relationships, and they sought damages that would have bankrupted me even if I won the original case. But the most devastating blow came when my Aunt Patricia, who had initially supported me and provided evidence of my father's financial manipulation, suddenly withdrew her testimony and claimed she had been confused about the details of her loan to him. When I confronted Patricia about her change of heart, she broke down crying and admitted that my father had threatened to expose embarrassing information about her divorce proceedings if she continued to cooperate with the investigation. "I am sorry, Scarlett," she sobbed, "but I cannot afford to have those details made public. My ex-husband would use them to try to get custody of my children. Your father found documentation of some financial mistakes I made during the divorce, and he is threatening to make sure my ex-husband's lawyers see everything." This revelation showed me just how extensive my father's manipulation and blackmail network had become. He had been collecting compromising information about family members and business associates for years, building an arsenal of leverage he could use to protect himself when his crimes were finally exposed. As my support network crumbled under my father's pressure campaign, I began to understand why so many people had suspected his behavior over the years, but never spoken up. He had created a system where challenging him meant risking exposure of your own vulnerabilities and mistakes. The preliminary hearing became a disaster. Without Amanda's recordings or Patricia's testimony about the loan fraud, my case was reduced to the basic embezzlement charges. My father's attorney painted me as a bitter daughter who was trying to destroy her family over normal sibling rivalry and parental favoritism. Miss Scarlett has always been jealous of her sister's relationship with their father, the defense attorney argued. Unable to accept that some children require more support than others, she has convinced herself that normal family financial decisions constitute criminal fraud. This case is not about justice. It is about a young woman who cannot accept that her father loves her sister differently than he loves her. Watching my father sit calmly in the courtroom, occasionally nodding sympathetically, as his attorney portrayed me as delusional and vindictive, I felt a despair deeper than anything I had experienced since finding those documents in his office. He had successfully turned my quest for justice into a story about my mental instability and jealousy. But even as I sat in that courtroom feeling defeated and isolated, I held on to one crucial piece of knowledge that my father did not know I possessed. Before Amanda had been bribed, and Patricia had been blackmailed, I had made copies of everything and shared it with someone my father would never think to pressure or threaten. My grandmother's best friend, Eleanor Mackenzie, had been quietly building her own case against my father, and she had resources and connections that even he could not manipulate or intimidate. Eleanor was about to enter this fight with evidence that would change everything. But first, I had to survive long enough for her help to matter. As I left the courthouse that day, I knew I was facing the darkest period of this entire ordeal. My father had successfully isolated me, discredited my evidence, and turned the legal system against me. But he had also revealed the full extent of his corruption and manipulation, and that revelation would ultimately become the foundation of his complete downfall. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday evening when I was at my lowest point, seriously considering whether I had the strength to continue fighting a battle that seemed increasingly hopeless. Eleanor Mackenzie's voice was steady and determined when she introduced herself as my grandmother's closest friend and former business partner. "Scarlett, dear, I have been waiting for the right moment to get involved in this situation," Eleanor said, "and watching your father destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses has convinced me that the time has come. Your grandmother asked me to watch over you if anything happened to her, and I have been doing exactly that." Eleanor was 78 years old, but her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent decades building and running successful businesses. She had co-owned a chain of women's clothing stores with my grandmother before they sold the business in the 1990s, and she had remained deeply involved in my grandmother's financial affairs until her death. "Your grandmother never trusted your father completely," Eleanor continued, "and she asked me to keep copies of all her important financial documents in my safe. She was particularly concerned about the trust arrangements and made me promise to ensure her wishes were honored. I have been documenting your father's activities since her funeral, and I have evidence that will restore your case and expose crimes you do not even know about yet." The next morning, I met Eleanor at her lawyer's office where she presented a collection of evidence that was more comprehensive and damaging than anything I had discovered on my own. Eleanor had not just been my grandmother's friend. She had been her informal financial advisor and had helped her structure the trust specifically to prevent the kind of manipulation my father had perpetrated. The most crucial piece of evidence was a series of recorded conversations between Eleanor and my grandmother during her final months. In these recordings, my grandmother explicitly stated her concerns about my father's treatment of me and her specific intentions for the trust distribution. She had recorded these conversations precisely because she suspected my father might try to challenge or alter her wishes after her death. "I want Scarlett to know that I see how hard she works and how little recognition she gets from her father." My grandmother's voice was clear and strong on the recording. "The trust is set up to reward dedication and responsibility, not to enable laziness and manipulation. If something happens to me, Eleanor, please make sure Scarlett understands that I always saw her worth, even when her family did not." But Eleanor's evidence went far beyond just reinforcing the original trust intentions. She had been systematically investigating my father's financial activities and had uncovered a network of fraud that extended into multiple business partnerships and investment schemes. Your father has been using his reputation and family connections to defraud investors for at least 7 years, Eleanor explained, spreading out bank records and business documents. He creates fake investment opportunities, uses money from new investors to pay returns to previous investors, and skims substantial amounts for his personal use. It is essentially a small-scale Ponzi scheme disguised as a family consulting business. The evidence Eleanor presented showed that my inheritance was just one source of funding for my father's fraudulent activities. He had been systematically stealing from business partners, client accounts, and family members to maintain his lifestyle and fund Melody's expenses while keeping his scheme operational. Most damning was Eleanor's documentation of my father's witness intimidation campaign. She had hired a private investigator to monitor his activities after Amanda's testimony was recanted, and they had recorded evidence of his attempts to bribe or blackmail multiple witnesses in my case. Your father made a critical mistake when he started threatening people, Eleanor's attorney Marcus Webb explained. Witness tampering and obstruction of justice are federal crimes, and the evidence Eleanor has collected gives us grounds to request FBI involvement in this case. Eleanor also provided something I desperately needed: financial resources to continue the legal fight. My father's counter lawsuit and the pressure campaign had nearly bankrupted me, but Eleanor had established a legal defense fund using money from her own savings and contributions from other people who had been victimized by my father's schemes. Your grandmother left me a substantial inheritance, Eleanor told me, specifically because she knew I would use it to protect you if necessary. This is exactly what she would want me to do with that money. But Eleanor brought more than just evidence and financial support. She brought credibility and connections that my father could not attack or undermine. As a respected businesswoman with decades of community involvement and no personal stake in family drama, Eleanor's testimony carried weight that mine alone never could. The FBI investigation that Eleanor's evidence triggered moved with surprising speed. Agent Patricia Martinez, who specialized in financial fraud cases, immediately recognized the sophistication of my father's scheme and the strength of Eleanor's documentation. This is one of the most well-documented cases of family financial fraud I have seen, Agent Martinez told us during our first meeting. Your father's mistake was targeting someone who had the resources and determination to build a comprehensive case against him. Most victims of family financial abuse never get this kind of support. Eleanor's private investigator had also uncovered evidence that Melody's role in the fraud was much more extensive than even Amanda's original recordings had suggested. Bank records showed that Melody had been actively helping to launder money through her various businesses and personal accounts, and she had been receiving payments for recruiting new victims into her father's investment schemes. Your sister is not just a beneficiary of your father's crimes, Agent Martinez explained. She has been an active participant in a criminal enterprise. The evidence suggests she has been helping to identify and target potential investors, particularly young people from wealthy families who might have access to inheritance money or trust funds. This revelation was simultaneously devastating and vindicating. Learning that Melody had been actively working to defraud others made me realize that our relationship had never been real. She had not just been the favored daughter. She had been my father's partner in a criminal operation that had victimized dozens of people over nearly a decade. But the most satisfying moment came when Eleanor revealed her final piece of evidence, a complete recording of the conversation where my father had bribed Amanda to recant her testimony. Eleanor's private investigator had been monitoring Amanda's phone with her knowledge, and they had captured my father explicitly offering money in exchange for false testimony. Your father is going to face federal charges for racketeering, wire fraud, money laundering, and witness tampering, Agent Martinez informed us. The evidence Eleanor has provided gives us everything we need to dismantle his entire operation and recover funds for all the victims. As we prepared for the new round of legal proceedings, Eleanor also helped me understand something crucial about my father's psychology and methods. Your father is a narcissist who believes he is smarter than everyone else, she explained. That arrogance is what made him keep such detailed records of his crimes. He never imagined that anyone would have the resources or determination to challenge him effectively. Eleanor's support also gave me something I had been missing throughout this entire ordeal: a sense of family connection and unconditional love. She had known me since I was a child, and she could provide perspective on my relationship with my grandmother that helped heal some of the wounds my father's manipulation had created. "Your grandmother was so proud of you," Eleanor told me one evening as we reviewed legal documents. "She used to show me your report cards and talk about your work ethic and integrity. She always said you reminded her of herself at that age, and she wanted to make sure you had the support you needed to build the life you deserved." With Eleanor's evidence, financial support, and emotional guidance, I finally felt prepared for the final phase of this battle. My father had spent months trying to isolate and discredit me, but he had never anticipated that his crimes would eventually bring together a coalition of victims and allies strong enough to bring down his entire criminal enterprise. The federal charges were filed on a Monday morning, and by that afternoon, my father and Melody were both in custody facing multiple felony counts. The investigation had grown to include over 30 victims and more than $2 million in fraudulent activities spanning nearly a decade. But even as I watched my father's carefully constructed world collapse around him, I knew that the most important victory was not legal or financial. It was the restoration of my relationship with my grandmother's memory and the discovery that I had never been alone in this fight. Eleanor's support had given me back the family connection I thought I had lost forever. The federal trial lasted 6 weeks, and every day brought new revelations about the scope and sophistication of my father's criminal enterprise. As victim after victim took the stand to describe how they had been defrauded, manipulated, and betrayed, I watched my father's facade of respectability crumble completely. The most devastating testimony came from Mrs. Patterson, an 82-year-old widow who had lost her entire retirement savings to one of my father's fake investment schemes. She explained how my father had befriended her at church, gained her trust through months of pastoral conversations, then convinced her to invest her late husband's life insurance payout in what he claimed was a guaranteed return opportunity. He seemed so knowledgeable and caring, Mrs. Patterson testified with tears in her eyes. He talked about wanting to help widows like me secure our financial future. I trusted him because he spoke so lovingly about his own family. I never imagined that someone who claimed to care about family values would steal from a grieving widow. Melody's trial was equally revealing. The prosecutors demonstrated that she had not been simply enjoying the benefits of her father's crimes, but had been actively recruiting victims through her social media presence and personal relationships. She had used her lifestyle and apparent wealth to attract young people into investment schemes, earning substantial commissions for each new victim she brought to her father. The evidence showed that Melody had specifically targeted college students and recent graduates, people who reminded me of myself during the years I was struggling to pay for school while she lived in luxury funded by stolen money. She had been profiting from the same demographic that her father had been making me feel I belonged to young people who needed to work hard and sacrifice to achieve their goals. During Melody's sentencing hearing, she finally showed her true character. Instead of accepting responsibility or showing remorse for the people she had helped defraud, she attempted to blame everything on our father and claimed she had been manipulated and controlled. "I was just trying to please my father," she testified. "He made me believe that this was normal business practice and I was too young and naive to understand what was really happening." But the prosecutor's cross-examination destroyed this narrative completely. They presented evidence of text messages where Melody had bragged about stupid people who were easy targets, and recordings where she had laughed about victims who lost their savings. Her attempt to portray herself as another victim backfired spectacularly when the jury saw clear evidence of her calculated cruelty and greed. My father received a sentence of 15 years in federal prison, along with orders to pay full restitution to all victims. Melody received 8 years and was ordered to forfeit all assets purchased with proceeds from the criminal enterprise. The Mercedes that had started this entire journey was seized and sold, with the proceeds going to victim compensation. But the legal victory was only part of my healing process. Eleanor had introduced me to a support group for victims of family financial abuse, and through that group, I discovered that my experience was unfortunately common, but rarely discussed openly. Meeting other people who had been betrayed by parents, siblings, and spouses who stole from them helped me understand that the problem was not my worthiness or lovability, but my father's fundamental lack of integrity and empathy. The support group also connected me with other young adults who had been scapegoated or marginalized in their families, while siblings received preferential treatment. Learning about these patterns of family dysfunction helped me realize that my father's behavior toward me had never been about my failings or shortcomings, but about his need to maintain control and avoid accountability. Through therapy and the support group, I also began to understand how my father's favoritism toward Melody had been part of his criminal strategy. By keeping me struggling and grateful for minimal support, he had ensured that I would be too busy surviving to examine his financial activities closely. Meanwhile, by making Melody dependent on his fraudulent income, he had guaranteed her silence and cooperation. Eleanor became the family I had always needed, but never had. She helped me use my portion of the recovered funds to start my own accounting practice, specializing in helping families protect themselves from financial abuse and fraud. Working with other victims gave my painful experience meaning and purpose, transforming my trauma into a tool for helping others avoid similar betrayals. The most healing moment came when I received a letter from Mrs. Patterson, the elderly widow, who had lost her retirement savings to my father's scheme. She thanked me for having the courage to expose his crimes and explained that the restitution payments had allowed her to remain in her home and maintain her independence. "Your bravery saved not just yourself, but all of us," she wrote. "Your grandmother would be proud of the woman you have become and the justice you fought to achieve." 2 years after the trial ended, I stood in the same dealership parking lot where I had first realized the extent of my father's betrayal. But this time I was there to buy my own car with money I had earned through honest work and careful financial planning. As I signed the paperwork for a modest but reliable vehicle, I thought about how much had changed since that graduation day. I had lost the father and sister I thought I knew, but I had gained something much more valuable, a clear understanding of my own worth, and the unshakable knowledge that I deserved to be treated with respect and honesty. Eleanor and the community of survivors I had found through my legal battle had become my chosen family people who valued integrity and supported each other through difficulties. The accounting practice I had built was thriving, and I had helped dozens of families protect themselves from financial abuse and recover from betrayals similar to what I had experienced. Every client who regained their financial security felt like a victory not just for them, but for my grandmother's memory and the values she had tried to instill in me. My father sends me letters from prison, occasionally still trying to manipulate me into believing that I overreacted and destroyed our family over money. I do not respond to these letters, but I keep them as reminders of how skilled he was at gaslighting and manipulation. Reading his continued attempts to avoid responsibility reinforces my decision to pursue justice rather than enable his behavior through silence and forgiveness. Melody was released after serving 5 years of her sentence, and she reached out to me through social media asking if we could rebuild our relationship. Her message was full of the same manipulative language my father used, focusing on family loyalty and forgiveness, while avoiding any real accountability for her actions. I blocked her immediately and felt nothing but relief at my ability to recognize and reject her manipulation attempts. The most meaningful relationship in my life now is with Eleanor, who has become the grandmother figure I thought I had lost. At 80 years old, she remains sharp, funny, and fiercely protective of the people she loves. She has taught me that family is not determined by blood relationships, but by mutual respect, genuine care, and shared values. Last month, Eleanor and I visited my grandmother's grave together for the first time since the trial ended. I finally felt peaceful enough to stand there and tell my grandmother about everything that had happened, including the justice that had been served and the community of love and support that had grown from her final gift to me. She knew you had the strength to fight for what was right, Eleanor told me as we placed fresh flowers on the headstone. She also knew that the fight would change you into exactly the kind of person she hoped you would become. Looking back on this entire experience, I understand now that my father's cruelty and favoritism were never about my inadequacies or Melody's superiority. They were about his fundamental inability to love anyone more than he loved money and control. The graduation day that started this journey was not the beginning of his betrayal, but simply the moment when his true nature became impossible to ignore. The sweet taste of justice was not just about seeing my father and sister face consequences for their crimes, though that satisfaction was real and important. The true victory was discovering that I had never been the problem in our family dynamic. I had been the threat to a criminal enterprise disguised as favoritism, and my integrity and determination had ultimately brought that enterprise to its deserved end. So, let me ask you something that has been on my mind since sharing this story with all of you. Have you ever experienced favoritism in your own family that seemed to go beyond normal sibling differences? Have you found yourself questioning whether you deserved the treatment you received, or wondering if there might be hidden motivations behind family dynamics that never quite made sense? I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because I have learned that these stories are far more common than we like to admit, and sharing them helps all of us heal and grow stronger. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of your own family experiences, please hit that like button to let me know and subscribe for more stories about finding justice and healing after family betrayal. Share this video with anyone who might need to hear that they are not alone in dealing with family manipulation or financial abuse, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is help each other recognize that we deserve better treatment than we have been receiving. Thank you for taking this journey with me, and for listening to one of the most difficult, but ultimately transformative experiences of my life. I hope that my story can serve as a reminder that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who need the strongest boundaries, and that choosing justice over false peace is always worth the temporary pain it might cause. Remember that your worth is not determined by how your family treats you, and that building a chosen family based on respect and genuine care is always better than accepting manipulation disguised as love.